I'm David Jacobs, and I teach at American University, but my primary role today is that I am president of DC LERA, the Labor and Employment Relations Association in Washington, DC and the surrounding area. It's great to see all of you. We have a great talk today from Thea Lee. I wanted to say something first about the Labor and Employment Relations Association, which is obviously a national organization with which professionals interested in labor management, public policy come together to share ideas about practices in the field. It was founded in 1947 as the Industrial Relations Research Association. It's the only multi-partite dialogue forum of its kind in the US that I can think of. DC LERA is the DC area chapter. We have people from the surrounding area, obviously, and we also have a great collection of diplomats from the embassies in town, the labor attaches. So we have a very lively set of luncheons or virtual sessions once a month. We're hoping to have luncheons once again. We encourage you to check out the website, dclera.org, and become members of DC LERA and the national organization. I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Wheeler of Global Trace Protocol Project, who will then introduce our friend Thea Lee. Are you ready, Jeff, to say hi?
I am indeed. Thanks, David, for the introduction. I wear a number of different hats. One is I'm a board member of DC LERA, and I teach at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service and the International Business Diplomacy Program. And I also head up a project that is funded by iLab called the Global Trace Protocol Project, which is implemented by Elevate. So I have a personal stake here, yes. But it's really great to introduce Thea Lee, who has been the Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs, otherwise known as iLab, since May 10th, 2021. Now, if you've been in this field for any period of time, you already know her, but I'll give a brief introduction for those of you who don't. Most recently, she was president of the Economic Policy Institute from 2018 to May 2021, and an international trade economist at API in the 1990s. From 97 to 2017, she worked at the AFL-CIO, where she served as Deputy Chief of Staff, Policy Director, and Chief International Economist. She served on the State Department Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, the Export-Import Bank Advisory Committee, the Board of Directors of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a number of other very important organizations. She currently serves on the board of the National Women's Law Center, as well as the National Advisory Board of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And I have to say, I'm thrilled at this initiative, Empower, which helps ensure that workers are in fact at the center of the agenda, because labor rights are fundamental human rights that are important by themselves, but they also help us achieve other objectives. Sustainable, broad-based economic growth to help reduce disparities in wealth and power, to promote democracy when we see a rise in authoritarianism, and also to promote the rights, the interests, and the dignity of the marginalized. And for those of us who work in supply chains, one of the best ways of ensuring compliance with these standards is empowering workers that are in the factories to do the monitoring and to bargain for the best interest of workers. One little quote I'll just state and then turn it over is from A. Philip Randolph, and you may know this quote: "At the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization." So that's a key interest here, is the organizations and workers being empowered to speak and act for themselves. And with that, I'll turn it over to Thea, and I will post a link to the Empower website in the chat. What we're going to do is we're going to take questions afterwards, which you can put into the chat, and then I'll moderate the questions. So turning it over to Thea.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you, David. Thanks to DC LERA for the invitation to talk to all of you today. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I see a lot of old friends and familiar faces and names here. So I'm going to actually try to be brief in my opening remarks so that we can have a vibrant Q&A session. So I do hope you will take advantage and put your questions into the chat so we can have a good conversation. So it is wonderful to be here to head iLab at this extraordinary and consequential moment in history. And I do think it is an amazing time. And I think that we have an opportunity to do some great work over the next couple of years. And I know all of you are people who are deeply engaged in that work, whether through the labor movement or research or the private sector, and really appreciate all of the work that you all have done and will continue to do. And I think that the reason why we have such a great opportunity is threefold. One is that this administration values worker voice and unions as a key element in democracy. And that hasn't been the case with previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican. So, you see it, I think, especially in the workers' task force, that Secretary Walsh and Vice President Kamala Harris headed up the task force on worker organizing and empowerment, which just issued its big report. And that is really about the domestic impact of unions and the importance and what every U.S. government agency can do to support worker organizing, to support unions, and to support worker voice. And I've never seen any kind of effort like that before in a previous administration. And I think it was really a testament to the commitment that this administration has to that. Secretary Walsh is a tremendous advocate for unions. He comes out of the labor movement. He was the head of the building trades before he became in Massachusetts, before he became mayor of Boston. And you can tell it's really in his blood and his guts is support for and belief in the power of unions and worker voice. But the work that we're doing now, I see as really the global component and maybe the next step of what the task force on worker organizing and empowerment is done. And one of the things that I think is important and that I've always talked about is what the connection is between the goals that we have for domestic labor market and economy, what we want to achieve in terms of equity, racial and gender equity, closing wage gaps and ending wage stagnation, protecting safe workplaces and decent work at home, that we cannot achieve those goals if we're not part of a global economy in which workers' rights are respected. And so that's, I think, the basic foundation for all of the work that we do. The other points that make this the moment in history to work on is that Congress has an unusual bipartisan consensus around some of this work right now. And we see it especially in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was signed into law on December 23rd by President Biden. But it had, I think it passed 428-1 in the House and was unanimously adopted in the Senate. And you all know that at this moment in history, there aren't that many things that garner bipartisan support. So I think it's important to see that there is that commitment there. And also, the America Competes Act and the USICA, which is the Senate version of it, also have elements that are very much focused on this. When I think about, our job of enforcing global labor rights through the US government, and ILAB, I would just say one thing, this is a fun fact that I learned since I came to ILAB, but that ILAB is the largest government agency in the world that is engaged in this work of lifting up workers' rights. And we have new tools in our toolbox. And as Jeff said, I've been doing this work for about 30 years. And so, in 1991, 30 years ago, we started talking about why NAFTA needed a labor chapter and it needed to be enforceable. And at the time, we were treated as kind of radical nutball fringe element or really naive people. But we built that case over 30 years. We built it with the research and the academic support from people who believed in it as well. But we also built it through political activism and organizing and steady and building coalitions with environmental and human rights and worker rights folks. And I think it's paid off in terms of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is the successor to NAFTA, and which does have an enforceable labor chapter with a pretty strong enforcement mechanism, the rapid response mechanism, which addresses some of the weaknesses in previous labor chapters. One is that it is very surgical, that it can be used against an individual company, an individual plant, if there are worker rights abuses there. and it's fast. And those were two of the main complaints that we in the labor movement had against previous labor chapters and trade agreements. So that's exciting. And along with USMCA, Congress gave ILAB about $180 million to strengthen workers' rights in Mexico over the course of about 4 years. That's a lot of resources, and that's resources that we're using to build the capacity of the Mexican government to inspect, to strengthen their labor inspections, to address gender equity in the labor movement, to build, to inform workers and unions and support them as they navigate the new labor law reform, and then to also help with the standing up of the new institutions, the new labor institutions that are implementing the new labor law reform and the USMCA there. So that's exciting. We also have another tool, which is, in the Tariff Act of 1930, which doesn't sound like it's a new tool, that's something that's been in place a long time, the prohibition against importing goods made in whole or in part with forced labor. But that provision wasn't really useful until Congress closed a big loophole in 2016. And now that provision, if you think about it for a little bit, it's very powerful. It's a very powerful tool that we can stop at the border. Goods that we know are made or have good reason to believe are made with forced labor. And that is something that has been used, I think, very effectively to address some of the allegations around forced labor in the Xinjiang province of China, as well as many other places. So that tool is one that, in my view, one of what we aim for with this work is to motivate both corporations and governments to address labor law, labor compliance problems. And having the risk of having your goods stopped at the border to the United States is a tremendously valuable and powerful motivator. The fourth piece is that the international consensus around this work is growing and strengthening. We see, especially in the European Union, that there is new attention to supply chain due diligence and new mandatory provisions that are being put into law of requiring companies to have more responsibility for what is in their supply chain, for knowing what kinds of labor conditions are used at every stage of the supply chain. I think that is tremendously important and powerful. And it's something also we see at the G7, for example, last year put out a statement around forced labor in supply chains. And here in the United States, not only do we have our Tariff Act of 1930, but the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is also a tremendously powerful tool, which creates a rebuttable presumption that goods made or imported from Xinjiang province have been made with forced labor unless the importer can demonstrate effectively that they are not. And so I think that's a really important piece. And one of the reasons that is so important is that due diligence is almost impossible in the Xinjiang province of China because the Chinese government has severely restricted the access to facilities by auditors, by governments, by unions, and therefore, until that access is there, I think it is right to say that it's difficult to prove whether those goods are made free of forced labor. So this is a new era of transparency and integrity in supply chains where there are new requirements being put on companies. And therefore, it's a really important moment in history where we need both the technology, as Jeff was describing, some of the work doing at Elevate is about trying to create the tools that can help us trace inputs of goods throughout the supply chain. And when I talk about the tools, there's another important piece, which is the supply chain tracing that ILAB has been involved in. ILAB, one of the things that we do is that every 2 years, we've been asked by Congress to put together a list of goods made with child labor and forced labor, the goods and the countries. And a couple of years ago, Congress asked us to go deeper and not just to list goods made with child labor and forced labor, but also to goods made with inputs that are made with child labor or forced labor. And that is a dramatically expanded mandate, but it is something that I think again, ratchets up the pressure and the power there. So, and we have great tools that we use in order to do this. Our Sweat and Toil app that I encourage folks to download. This is, you can get it from any app store, but it combines on your cell phone access to thousands of pages of research around child labor and forced labor and what goods are made. We have a better trade tool, which you can access on our website, which allows you to connect all the research that we do on child labor and forced labor to trade data, to import data. So you can find out where there is an overlap between the goods that the United States imports and the risk of child labor and forced labor. And finally, we have our Comply Chain app, which is a tool for due diligence for companies to use to strengthen their supply chain transparency. But all of this comes together in what Jeff started by talking about, the Empower Initiative. So this is an awesome acronym that I didn't come up with, but Mark Mittelhauser, my Associate Deputy Undersecretary, did. It's the multilateral partnership for organizing worker empowerment and rights. And this was launched at the Summit for Democracy by Secretary Walsh back in December of 2021. And it is a way of marshaling the resources of the US government and beyond to strengthen worker organizing, the worker voice, worker power, and unions. So within the United States, it's the ILAB and the State Department and the US Agency for International Development. Together, we are committing $122 million to strengthening workers' rights globally over the next 2 years. This has never been done before. This is the largest scale that the US government has ever committed to freedom of association and collective bargaining abroad. And there are a couple of key elements to it. I think Jeff has put the link in the chat, but to strengthen free and independent trade unions, support labor law reform and enforcement, promote worker organizing and the innovative use of collective bargaining to improve livelihoods, and then extending labor law coverage. And this is important in a lot of countries, particularly in developing countries, in vulnerable, low-wage employment and sectors that are excluded often from labor law protection, especially the informal economy. And we know in many developing countries, the vast majority of workers are in the informal economy. So that kind of work, I think, is really, really important. And the reason this is a multilateral initiative, not just a US government initiative, is that we are also inviting in and working with partners in the philanthropic sector. A group called Forge has committed another $100 million to the Empower Initiative. And then we're also working with other governments, including we've had outreach from Germany, Norway, Sweden, Canada, and many other governments, also some that we're talking to about both doing the domestic work around freedom of association and collective bargaining, as well as helping us in the global work. So that is the Empower Initiative. And it's really, I mean, for me, the part that's exciting about it is the recognition and the connection to democracy, that you can't actually have vibrant, robust, sustainable democracy if you don't have worker organizations and unions and the ability for workers to stand up for themselves, both in the political system as well as at the workplace. So we are excited about this work. We think there's a tremendous potential for it. And with that, let me pause and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Thea, for that overview. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll start with a question or two. Since we're representing LERA, we have all these great academics who've done a ton of research on work organizations at all these various universities, some of which are on here. And I'm wondering, to what extent is the Empower going to be informed or tap into that great wealth of research?
That's a great question. And as you know, I come out of the research world myself, so this is close to my heart. We actually, one of the things that we are trying to do, it's not entirely new, but it's a little bit new for iLab, is to be really focusing in on worker organizing and freedom of association and collective bargaining. One of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing, first of all, is that our technical assistance in every country needs to be tailored to that country. We know there's no one size fits all. Like, you don't just give somebody $1 million and ask them to go out and organize unions. You have to know sort of what exists, what are the obstacles, are there legal obstacles, are there other kinds of, corruption or violence that workers might face, challenges they might face as they're organizing. But we want to be able to do a better job than we've done in the past around measuring the impact and the effectiveness of the work that we're doing. And so for that, we are going to need a lot of help from our research colleagues, and would love to, be able to, and we're trying to do this the best we can, but I think there's a lot of room for strengthening this work, is to rely on academic research about what works and what doesn't work in terms of developing countries, informal sector organizing, gender equity, vulnerable groups, all of that, and then to be able to incorporate that into the design of our technical assistance projects. So that is very important to us. And, I would like to see, maybe a repository, maybe it's something that LERA can work on, is to be able to summarize in one place, or to compartmentalize all of the research that's done on freedom of association and collective bargaining. What works best, and which countries are most strategic in terms of both trade enforcement actions as well as technical assistance projects.
Yes, thank you. Well, we've had those discussions within DC LERA about sponsoring some kind of a forum or a discussion to discuss that research. And also on the national level, there is the LERA National Conference in June, which will be unpacking the research in some of these areas. So there's a number of questions I'll touch on. One is a very good one that's many wonder about, which is the USMCA really presented a new structure, rules of origin and all sorts of new requirements in it. So is USMCA or the labor provisions going to be a template for future trade agreements?
That is a great question. And if I were queen of the world, the answer would be a definitive yes. I would love to see the USMCA provisions. I think we're always learning. And this is one of the things that's great about this work. And then for me, having been in this for 30 years, is we're always learning. As we negotiated the NAFTA crappy labor side agreement, we used that for many years. We found out what didn't work about it. And then, so the Jordan agreement was an improvement over that, but it still also had weaknesses. And then the Peru, Panama, South Korea, Colombia provisions, from also called the May 10th deal, were a little bit better. So we've been improving steadily as we've gone over the years, and USMCA was the culmination. But of course, it's not done yet. It could always get better. I mean, essentially, the answer is it's up to Congress and to some extent the administration. But also, in order to, let's say, go back and strengthen the labor chapters in existing trade deals, and the one that would be at the top of my list is the DR-CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement. That has extraordinarily weak labor provisions because it was done in the middle of the Bush administration, and they sort of went backwards from what we had put in place before. So the CAFTA labor provisions are just that countries have to enforce their own labor laws, not that they have to meet an international standard. There's no enforceable component there. That would be a huge improvement. But in order to do that, we have to renegotiate with the 6 countries. And that's pretty challenging to do. So you have that, but also we have, and this is one of the things that is important about this moment, is we have a very strong ally over at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Ambassador Catherine Tai is somebody I've known for a long time. And she and I have been, I'd say, friends for a long time. And she is completely committed to this worker-centered trade policy and to negotiating it. So I think she's completely on board, but we have to figure out our priorities in terms of negotiating with other countries, getting Congress to pass it, and so on. So I guess I would sort of call on all of you to be as supportive as possible and make sure that your members of Congress know that you would support strengthening the labor provisions in existing trade agreements. I don't know how many new trade deals we're going to be working on. There's the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which is somewhat less than a full trade deal, but it is something where there is certainly a labor component to the conversations that are happening there.
Yeah, I guess a related question would be, it to be seen is whether the USMCA tweaks in the language will cure what were some of the problems in the Guatemalan arbitration decision, some of the burdens of proof. I know there was an attempt in the USMCA to do that, and I think that's yet to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think USMCA is already a million steps better than what we have with respect to Guatemala and CAFTA, because the speed is one thing. I mean, I think everybody, maybe many people, I'm not sure how closely you all follow this, but I was at the AFL-CIO when we brought the labor rights case against Guatemala in, I think it was 2008. And it took 9 years to resolve that case. And literally during the time that we were doing it, they had the nerve to come back to us after 4 or 5 years and tell us that the research wasn't fresh, that we had to go back. It was like, well, if you let it sit on somebody's desk for 4 or 5 years, then it won't be fresh. That's right. But should that be our job at the AFL-CIO to have to go back and redo the research every couple of years while you drag your feet and so on. So the rapid response mechanism, the speed of it is a huge advantage already. And there is some clarity in terms of closing some of the loopholes that slowed down labor provisions in the past.
Great. We have another question from Benoit, I believe it is, or Benoit. And how will the Empower Initiative coordinate with ILO initiatives and mechanisms? What's the relationship with the ILO?
That's a great question. And the ILO has been very supportive of Empower. In fact, talking to Secretary Walsh, spoke to Director General Guy Ryder not too long ago, and the Director General was very supportive of Empower and wanted ILO to be a key partner in this work. And so we are thrilled to have the ILO as a partner with Empower. I think everyone knows that the ILO is a tripartite organization, has governments and business and workers as part of its constituents, its member bodies. And so that's wonderful, because we're going to need all three of those components, all three of the tripartite partners to be enthusiastic supporters and implementers here. So, but I think at the moment, we're still actually working out, like, where is Empower housed? We don't want it to be just the US government. We want it to be international in focus, but we're looking to have as little structure as possible. What we really want to do is to have this be something which is nimble, where we have maybe guidelines and criteria for what it means to be part of the Empower project. And then we invite in both governments and unions. ITUC and the AFL-CIO are some of our guiding founding partners in this work. So I guess the short answer is we're still working through all the details on that, but we expect the ILO to be very much supportive and ally and partner in all of this work. And the ILO works with iLab all the time. So some of the projects that we are funding through the Empower Initiative will be carried out by ILO country and regional teams. So that's hopefully very mutually supportive and complementary.
Great. And Dan Marshall pointed out this very interesting election and the Mexican auto plant, the success of an independent union. So the question, is that a harbinger of things to come in the future, or just one of these kind of one-off experiences?
That's a great question, Dan. And it is certainly our hope that the GM Salau election that happened a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was February 1 and 2, was a tremendously important and impactful outcome. So for those of you who aren't following it as closely as we do, this was one of the first rapid response mechanism cases happened at this plant. There's around 6,000 workers at the GM Salau plant I was trying to remember the state. And there was an election over the collective bargaining agreement. So this is, I guess, to step back just a minute, that you have the USMCA, you have two things happening in Mexico. One is the USMCA is in place, but the other is that Mexico embarked on a very ambitious labor law reform in 2019. And part of the labor law reform required that every collective bargaining agreement in the country be made available to the workers, and the workers have an opportunity to vote whether they want it or they don't want it. And the reason for this is that this was one of the key problems and weaknesses that we saw in Mexico, was the protection unions and the collective bargaining contracts that workers had that they didn't know about, that they'd never seen, that they hadn't approved of. So this is part of this process that's playing out. It's very ambitious. It's a lot of work. Every collective bargaining agreement in the country has to be done, but the GM Salau workers rejected their collective bargaining agreement back in August. But the reason we had to bring a rapid response mechanism case was that the very first version of the collective bargaining vote was tainted, that there were ballots being discarded. And so the Mexican government stepped in, USTR self-initiated a case, and the culmination of that was the workers getting to choose their own union on February 1st and 2nd. And as I said, this is a big workplace, 6,000 workers, but there's been organizing going on at this workplace for many years. And at the end of the day, there was 90%, almost 90% turnout for this vote. And almost 75% of the workers chose the independent union, Cynthia. So they threw out their old union that had been what we call a protection union, the CTM, and they were able to choose their own union. There's a wonderful woman leader, Alejandra Morales. She's the real deal. She comes off the factory floor for 20 years, and she is a very dynamic leader. And a lot of people that I know from my early days working in NAFTA, like Hector de la Cueva, have been involved in the organizing at the GM plant. So it's very exciting, and I think it's a huge demonstration of the value of worker organizing that's happening in Mexico, and the law is being supportive of workers being able to do that. There's another big case coming up next week, the Tridenex case, which was also subject of a rapid response mechanism case, an auto parts plant in Tamaulipas. But I've been to Mexico twice now since I've been in this job, that's twice as much as I've been to any other country. And because we have so much work going on there. And I have to say, I'm very optimistic, cautiously optimistic, because I've met with workers and unions and civil society groups and the government. And I do think that there is just a tremendous positive energy going on and people really trying to make this work. And I think there's a short window there to demonstrate to Mexican workers that that this is worth the trouble and the risk and the work that they need to do in order to do it. So I think there's a lot of organizing going on in Mexico right now.
It's an interesting bookend to the very first case under the NAFTA side accord, which was a group of women at Sony in Tamaulipas. And despite all this high level attention and ministerial consultations, it was a complete failure. These women were fired and the independent union was busted. So this is kind of a neat little riposte.
Yeah, no, I remember I used that case all the time as a demonstration of why the NAFTA labor side agreement was useless, was that even when the workers went to the trouble to file this case at Sony, and they won essentially because the dispute settlement process said, yes, you're right. The Mexican government has failed to effectively enforce its own laws with respect to independent union registration. But winning that case achieved nothing because the workers were fired, as you say, the union never did form. And it was very frustrating and demoralizing for everybody involved. But this is it's a new era, I hope. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of challenges along the way.
So Leon Finks asked a question or two questions, part of which you may not be able to answer. But one is, what is the relationship with the Solidarity Center? And what and where are the most promising specific initiatives underway? And what are the main obstacles? Might be a little early in the process, but yeah. Do you have any answers?
Well, in terms of the first question, in some ways, Empower was the brainchild of the Solidarity Center. So they have been a strong partner for us at every step of the way. And some of you may know that Molly McCoy, who was the political director at the Solidarity Center, and who was one of the people who sort of brainstormed the Empower concept, has come over to iLab. So she's working with us as my new political associate deputy undersecretary. And so Solidarity Center and AFL-CIO and the International Trade Union Confederation are key partners for us in all of this work, because they have the connections and the resources. And of course, Solidarity Center, as Jeff said, Elevate is an organization that is a grantee. Solidarity Center has received and will receive many grants from iLab as well. They've been a great partner for us in Mexico in particular, helping to set up, for example, worker centers in different parts of the country, bringing academics and worker organizers together and building capacity and strengthening that. What are the most promising specific initiatives underway, and what are the main obstacles? There are a lot of great things going on. I mean, you can find on our website, on the iLab website, if you look down at our projects, you can see a lot of the different things that we're funding. But I'm excited about several of them. I mean, I think the Mexico is where we have the most resources right now. So there is just a lot going on. One of them is on gender equity in the labor movement. And, seeing Alejandra Morales elected the leader of the Cintia Union was a very exciting piece of it. But it's certainly something where we want to make sure that women in particular are able to exercise leadership and be able to play an important role in union organizing. I think, we have a lot of projects going on around the world that are about, let's say in Malaysia, working with migrant workers who we saw were really treated badly during the pandemic in particular, and there was a lot of problems with wage theft. So that's one of the things that we're working on. As I think people know, we do a lot of work on child labor and forced labor, both in terms of research and uncovering where the problems are so that we can resolve them and give governments the kind of guidance they need to fix problems at an earlier stage. But one of the other projects that I guess I'm excited about in Mexico, one is that we are supporting the Mexican government in the implementation of the labor law reform. So for example, this collective bargaining agreements, there are hundreds of thousands, I think, of collective bargaining agreements. And we provided some of the technical resources to help make sure that they could be digitalized and eventually made public on a website so that workers can see not only their own collective bargaining agreement, but others. Because, if you're being asked to decide, do you want to ratify or reject your collective bargaining agreement, it's kind of useful to know, is it a good agreement or a bad agreement? And so to make sure that people have access to and resources around some of that. So, but I urge people to go check out our website and you can see some of the projects that are going on, but especially with respect to the union power.
So we're having a lot of great questions. We have all these experts. We should compose them as a panel and have a brainstorming session. One question I was going to ask is also about the informal workers. So union density is really low anyways. And in the informal sector, there's very little representation. It's hard to maintain. And then you have the growth of non-standard work, or as David Weil, also a LERA member, has pointed out, is the fissured workplace. So how is iLab and Empower going to grapple with that issue?
That's a big, hard issue, but a couple of ways. And as I said earlier, there's not going to be a single answer in different places. I mean, one of the places we see a lot of informal work is in the agricultural sector. And so, I guess for example, in Mexico, one of the issues is around childcare and safe workplaces and so on. And I think you can start with safety and health at the workplace and make sure that, as informal sector workers begin to raise their voices and use their power and come together in collective action around something like safety and health, then that can be the precursor to union organizing. So I guess part of what we want to do is create a path for workers to whatever they want to do, but especially if they want to organize a union and remove obstacles from that path. Another piece of it is when, in a lot of countries, this is true, where the union can reach out to informal sector workers and be supportive. And unions tend to have more, more institutional presence and resources and so on. So we saw that, for example, in India, the development of the Self-Employed Workers Association, which was an organization of women workers mostly who were in the informal sector, but it did evolve into a union with support. And I think that's the kind of path that we're looking at, understanding that there are legal obstacles as well as cultural obstacles and so on, but trying to educate folks and remove some of the legal obstacles. And some of the advice that we give to governments, for example, and we can give it to our own government, is to ensure that that the labor laws are not so hostile to workers who might be trying to organize in the informal sector.
Yeah. So we have a question from Petra Hansson of the Swedish Embassy. One thing I'll note is that the Swedish unions, I used to work with a bit, have really been on the forefront of worker rights. And TCO, one of the unions, when office workers were complaining about their computers' glare issues with it, they negotiated with their employers to improve the standards for computers, and they came up with their own standards, which they required of manufacturers. So the union helped write the early supply chain standards that computer manufacturers had to follow. So you still see now TCO certified, which was started by that Swedish Trade Union Federation. Petra's question is, what do you hope to get? What does iLab hope to get from other foreign governments with the Empower Initiative? What would you like to see them do?
Thank you, Petra, for the question. And I think what we're looking for is partners. And, when we come up with our criteria and our guidelines and so on, this is not necessarily a case of like brand new money, like the $122 million that we were able to pull together between USAID, state, and iLab. That's mostly money that was committed, but what we're trying to do is to create momentum and synergy and coordination. And I think that could be very valuable. So with governments like the Swedish government that already are working on a lot of this, are investing in worker organizing and collective bargaining and freedom of association globally, is to bring these folks into a single room so that we can both show people what the good work is that's going on, but also connect it and create some synergies and momentum and public impact of that work. So we are looking for commitments. I was in Germany last week for the G7 employment task force group, and so talking to the Germans also about what they might be doing on this front. So this is something that we just hope we can bring everybody into a room and come up with a pretty open structure so that we don't spend all of our time drafting rules, but be able to sort of draw on and marshal all the resources that that people are putting there, and maybe draw on some new resources as well.
Another good question. These are great questions. Ali Patonic, which is, will the regional development banks become a partner to Empower? So this is interesting. IMF, World Bank, if he's there, how can they feed into this effort?
Great question, Ali. Nice to see you. I think this is part of what I get excited about is when I think about like all the tools in the toolbox, so that, if there's development financing that happens, I always want to see, strong labor conditions and enforceable labor conditions in the financing. There is there's definitely some conversations that happen around labor conditions and development finance. And this is important for the United States. There's a lot of we have the Build Back Better World initiative that is starting to play out, which is partly about infrastructure funding and development finance and so on. I think that's a very important piece of this project. I mean, that's more, I don't know if it's as much about Empower as it is just about the development finance agencies using their position, their force, their financing to incentivize good labor conditions. Because, you know, if you're a development bank and you're trying to address poverty and failures of development and democracy, then it seems like you should definitely want to be strengthening labor unions and labor rights. And so I think, and we're about to bring somebody on board to help us work on this particular issue. We've had somebody working on it for a while, but we're trying to strengthen our focus on the development banks, what their role is. So thank you for that question. And the answer is yes, we hope.
And then Dclera Brooks, our kind of in-house USMCA NAFTA expert, has a question really about growing women leadership, asking, has the administration considered negotiation of women's economic empowerment agreements with trade partners modeled on the Women's Economic Empowerment Agreement?
It's a really good question, Dclera. And I know that the gender equity language in the USMCA and in the Mexico labor law reform has actually been impactful. You know, that's something that gets mentioned where, you know, even when I'm meeting with like maquiladora workers in Mexico, they raise it. Like they know that there are gender equity provisions that have been put into law and that are part of the USMCA enforcement mechanism. So I think it's really important to do that. So I don't know whether it is now, you know, part of that discussion in Central America. Is it, and maybe this is a question for Dclera, is it a standalone, the Women's Economic Empowerment Agreement between the US and Mexico, that stands alone, that's separate from USMCA, or is there some that is part of the trade agreement? But I mean, the other piece where that might come up is in like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which I mentioned earlier, where, you know, this is sort of a pretty broad set of discussions that are going on, and labor rights has definitely been a part of that. So it seems like it's something that would fit in that context as well.
So her answer is yes. It was negotiated by Hillary Clinton with her counterpart.
Great.
So now we have a more provocative question from John Russo, casting some shade on Ned. Given the labor movement's past relationship with the National Endowment for Democracy, she says, undermined global labor organizing. What's your relationship with Ned today?
Well, I think that's maybe more of a question for probably the Solidarity Center. I mean, there is a lot of important financing that happens through the National Endowment for Democracy, and some of it has definitely helped independent union organizing. I don't think ILAB has a relationship with Ned, at least I haven't come across that in my first 9 months on the job. But my view on this, I don't have a strong view because I haven't worked very closely with Ned, but that it is something that has evolved and has, you know, given the Solidarity Center, for example, a lot of financial support that I know the Solidarity Center has put to good uses. So that's.
Yeah, I don't think there's any relationship of Ned with ILAB. They've been a partial funder of the Solidarity Center, a minority of the Solidarity Center's budget. Okay, Thomas's question. The issues in other governments and MFI is mostly not on political appointment level, but involves the economics profession in the world with whom they interact. This might be a question of like, who's setting the development agenda? Is it the economists, the lawyers, the activists?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think there's one answer because the US government is a big place. But I would say that from my engagement so far, that there are a lot of people who think like we do in the US government throughout. So I mentioned Catherine Tai over at USTR, but you know, we have allies. Gladys Cisneros, who used to be at the Solidarity Center, has a labor portfolio at the National Security Council. I don't think there's ever been a labor portfolio at the National Security Council, to my knowledge, before this. But we also have great partners at the State Department, the Commerce Department. We've got some really strong folks. And I think there is an attempt within this administration to rethink some of the, I would say, the flawed economic thinking that has dominated this field in the past. So I wouldn't declare victory yet because it's still early days and some of these battles are playing out as we speak. But I would say that, for example, we talk about worker-centered trade policy or foreign policy for the middle class, that this administration is trying to flesh out, in real time, that part of the understanding of that is that economists have steered us wrong in the past with respect to globalization. And so that's certainly, that's my history where I come from, which is fighting against the kind of simplistic textbook rhetoric around free trade is good for everybody all the time, and trying to get a little bit underneath that to say, what are the circumstances under which what kinds of trade policy and what kind of conditionalities and protections and how vigorously we enforce them, how can we use those more effectively? And I feel like we've won some of the intellectual battle on that front. That when we started with the NAFTA battle, people used to say to us, labor is not part of trade policy. And people don't say that anymore. People understand that enforceable labor and environmental standards are part of US trade agreements, and that that's an important part of how we engage in the world. So I'm excited about that.
It's great. Well, one thing I've wondered about is, when I came out of labor, I was the president of the union at the Department of Labor for a couple of years, and now I'm on the supply chain side. And there's just such a growing amount of pressure and interest in things going on. And there's a great opportunity for engaging in the supply chain work. And so that's a question, is there an opportunity here for unions and workers to be empowered to play an important role in ensuring verification conformance to these standards, where there are very few unions that currently operating at the moment?
No, I think it's absolutely the case. And, as what I said before, I really mean it, that this is a new era in terms of supply chain traceability, transparency, and integrity. That when I used to, early, I guess in the late 1990s, when the whole, I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember the Kathy Lee Gifford situation where she was crying on TV. She was a TV anchor about, bad labor conditions in her garment line. And a lot of the conversations that we had with folks after that time were the companies saying, we can't possibly be expected to know what's in our supply chain. And they would basically, patronize me. I was working for the AFL-CIO, like, little girl, like, you're so naive, you don't understand. Like, I have thousands of subcontractors. How can I be expected to know, whether they're using child labor or forced labor or other horrible, unsafe working conditions or repressing unions? And that used to frustrate me because I would say, listen, you pay for it, you put your name on it. In principle, you're doing some kind of quality control if you're going to, buy inputs and put them into your products and put your fancy brand name that you paid a lot of money for onto it. You should know what's in your supply chain. And I feel like now we are beginning to have those tools where we can effectively say to companies, if you don't know what's in your supply chain, you may not have access to key markets anymore, the European Union, the United States, and maybe others as well. And that's motivating. So that's part of what cheers.
Great. Well, since we're coming down to 4 minutes, Thea, do you have any kind of last comments? And before I turn it over to David?
No, it's just wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you for the amazing questions. Those were a really great set of questions and a great conversation. So I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and to have the opportunity to be in this conversation. I look forward to it. Hopefully, we will all stay optimistic and confident as this work goes forward.
That's great. And Ted Smith just shared with us a link to, I guess that would be the America Competes Act, which has all sorts of provisions related to the supply chain. And there are some labor-related issues in there, specifically on fishing, as well as hopefully promoting harmonization of standards and the integration of social responsibility standards into the global supply chains in semiconductors and related realms. So there's a lot going on. It's very exciting. Thank you for these comments. I think it gets us all excited, enthusiastic, and we can go back into our research and debate and discuss and present some new ideas too. So David, do you have any last comments, any last words?
Thank you,
President.
Thea. Yes, thank you, Thea, very much for the presentation. It was great to see you and great to hear you in dialogue with this entire group. Thank you, Jeff, for moderating. This has been a very informative session and very inspiring in many respects. Don't forget to come back next month, March 16th, to see Ernest Dubester of the Federal Labor Relations Board, who is an appointee of Biden as well, and is facing very interesting questions in the transition in terms of values and policies in the federal sector. So on dclera.org, sister, I hope to see all of you very soon. You can get in touch with any of us by our emails and by waving dramatically. So thanks a lot, Thea. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Bernadette,
Jeff.
and
Thanks,
Emily,
everyone.
for your management.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
folks. Good to see you all.
Cheers.